Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Akara and Coca Report. Returning to the show is Jeff Deist, president of the Mises Institute, with whom we are going to talk about the response to the COVID pandemic. I first want to say a few words about the Mises Institute. We've had the privilege of having several scholars associated with it as guests on the show, mainly economists such as Robert Murphy, Peter Klein, and most recently Per Byland. The Mises Institute is a major center of learning for Austrian school economics, and Austrian school economics is a heterodox school of economic theory. Its approach to the study of economics is unlike that of mainstream schools that listeners may be familiar with, like neoclassical, Keynesian, or so-called Chicago school economics. One way Austrian economics is radically different is in its rejection of quantitative models to explain or predict economic phenomena. Austrian economists avoid using mathematical or statistical modeling because they believe, correctly in my opinion, that social phenomena and phenomena which involve human action should not be studied with the methods of the physical sciences. I mention this aspect of Austrian economics because the huge controversy that is now exploding about the predictive models for the COVID-19 pandemic may be a good case in point for that position. But the Mises Institute is not just a center of learning for economic theory. It is also a center for heterodox political analysis and discussion, offering perspectives that rarely fit the standard left-right or liberal-conservative framework of discussion. The Institute, and in particular its very vibrant website at Mises.org, with its vast online library of free books, articles, video lectures, podcasts, etc., offers theoretical and practical perspectives on political and communal life that is broadly situated in the classical liberal tradition, but offers a range of viewpoints that are always thought-provoking. So I urge all the listeners who are not familiar with the Mises Institute to at least visit its website at Mises.org. Having said that, Jeff is the president of the Mises Institute. He is not an economist by training, but he comes from the legal profession, and he also spent many years as an advisor and chief of staff to former congressman and physician Ron Paul. Jeff writes and speaks regularly. His commentary on social issues is always excellent, incisive, and insightful. And there are two articles of his that will form the basis for our discussion today. One piece written with the entire editorial board of Mises.org with the self-explanatory title of, quote, "End the Shutdown," unquote, was published on March 31st. And another that Jeff wrote just a few days ago entitled "What Governors Can Do" is a kind of open letter to US governors about dealing with the COVID pandemic. I apologize for this long-winded introduction, but Jeff, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Michelle. Great to see you. Great to see Anish too.
Great having you back. So Jeff, what's the reason for ending the shutdown today, immediately?
Well, you alluded to statistical and mathematical models. It turns out they don't work in the physical sciences either. They don't work in either. They don't work in social science. They don't work in physical science. They're all screwed up. We don't know what the hell. I don't want everyone to hear the word model again for the rest of my life.
Okay, but even if we take out the model, is your position sort of utilitarian, where you say, listen, the shutdown is going to cause more harm, more pain than without it, or what's the approach here?
Well, our position is that there should never have been a lockdown, and that it should be ended immediately, and that this virus does not rise to the level of threat that warrants or justifies in any way the tremendous amount of harm that's going to come from shutting down the United States economy. We've got already like 14 million new unemployed people. We've got people locked up in their houses. We've got people eating, drinking, psychologically becoming damaged, committing suicide, losing health insurance. We have people who need MRIs and CAT scans and cancer screenings. We need people who need their teeth cleaned. We need people who need mammograms. I'm a little irate because I started an expensive course of orthodontics for my daughter recently, and she's already behind with respect to the bi-monthly tightening or whatever it is. So,
well, I'm irate because I can't get a haircut.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here, and it's an example of the seen and the unseen.
Right. No, I agree, but let me press you a little bit more because, forget the models. We saw images from China. We saw, hard to interpret, of course, But we saw hospitals, and then we hear about New York, and we see, bodies being taken out, in body bags and whatnot. So without the models, I mean, one could conceive of a scenario where, this thing, if you don't do anything, the it's going to accumulate. It's going to, the fire is going to just take over the whole country. And so what do you say to that? I mean, is it a matter of sort of a gut feeling, or on what basis do we say this is going to be more painful than that, or
Well, the question is who decides and who acts to shut down anything. Had this been, let's say, a larger pandemic, let's say it was on pace to cause 1 million U.S. deaths in 2020, instead of, maybe we're at about 22,000 now, maybe it'll cause 30,000, 50,000, I don't know.
Mhm.
Either way, the question is who decides what happens in the economy, who decides who gets to travel, who decides who gets to leave home. And I think that decision is always best made closer to home, as locally as possible. And part of what I've been writing about recently is you just have very different situations in certain boroughs of New York versus, let's say, a sparsely populated state like Wyoming or South Dakota. So I don't think we need the same set of rules. And when you say we need to stop the fire, I guess the question I have for you is who is we?
Mhm.
And how do we determine that? And I don't think government's very good at making big, far-reaching decisions with very, very, very imperfect knowledge.
I certainly, yeah, I certainly agree with you. But again, playing the devil's advocate, people will say, "Listen, we're communicating vases. I mean, you can't. How do you isolate? You have a policy in New York, but what about New Jersey or Connecticut and whatnot, and people traveling and so forth? And so, what's the response to that?"
Well, that's the world we live in, but there's technology and medicine available to deal with viruses. It's a virus. It appears to be, although we don't know for certain. And again, the data is still very inconclusive. It appears to be maybe a nastier virus, a somewhat more deadly virus than our standard flu. We have the common cold that's been around obviously for millennia, and we don't have an effective vaccine necessarily for what we call the common cold, which I guess is a type of coronavirus in itself. And so, these are bigger questions about what's the role of government. Is government here to protect us from every conceivable harm? And I don't think it is. I don't think that everything bad that happens has a ready or easy answer, either in government or in the private marketplace. I'm not saying that there's some snap your fingers answer, but man, shutting down the world for I think maybe 100,000 deaths worldwide so far, and I would challenge how many of those deaths are actually caused by the virus per se, as opposed to having the virus as a contributing factor or just present. Um, Man, that seems way out of whack to me. If you want to call that a utilitarian argument, I guess I'll accept it.
Well, it's. Yeah, I think it's more of a principled argument if you talk about the principles of who should decide, and the question of is it the government's role to avoid the consequences of these natural epidemics. That to me is perhaps a more persuasive argument. But let's continue to explore it further. If the decisions are going to be more local, are the states, if we talk about the United States, sort of the natural place where the decisions should be made?
They're probably the natural place. I mean, governors have a lot more discretion and a lot more uh, money at their disposal than city councils or mayors. I think it would depend, but I mean, there are parts of the United States where there's 2 or 3 people per square mile. I
Mhm.
mean, whatever law you pass, whatever directive you impose, it's not going to matter much. People are going to do what they're going to do in the middle of Wyoming, for example. So I think that the idea that anybody can just craft a solution to this, I think is just wrong. It's just utopian. So we muddle through as best we can, and we try to put this thing out, extinguish it. Um, and I think that's best done with a sense, at the local level, with a sense of the trade-offs involved, because there are trade-offs. I mean, that seems to be missing in people's minds, that there's no trade-offs here, that of course we have to do this. It's a matter of life and death. Well, it's not so simple. There's a lot of other things to consider, and the economy is not something separate and removed from our health and well-being. It's a critical part of it. And that's, I think, that's been lost, especially early on, around late February, early March. There was sort of this mentality like, well, of course we have to shut down schools. Of course we have to shut down Major League Baseball and pro golf, and this seemed crazy to me.
Anish, you're muted.
Part of the issue is that in late February, early March, we just didn't have you had to make decisions without information. So it became clear when Italy hit, for instance, that this virus clearly was not contained to any degree in China. And then you had these scenes from Milan and Lombardy, that northern province in Italy, where you certainly had folks that the health system was clearly overwhelmed, and nobody explicitly comes out and says it, but the reason the mortality rate in Lombardy is high, like 12-13%, which is really high, is because they just ran out of ventilators, and so they had to basically, you come in, they don't have a ventilator, you pass. So when that happened in Italy, that was in, I think, last week of February, first week of March or so. That's when those scenes were coming out. It became obvious that this wasn't contained. Also, it was the case that what we had been doing in the U.S. was just screening high-risk people. We didn't even test people for COVID who were coming from Italy until Italy happened, and by then we knew it was too late. So what we were dealing with in first week of March, second week of March was, it's possible that we could be, each of our local places, whether it be Pittsburgh, whether it be Philadelphia, whether it be New York City, we could all be Lombardy, Italy, or Wuhan, China in 2 weeks, because right now in the community, because we hadn't been testing from Europe, we could have thousands of people that are positive. And once you get enough people, and once you get enough new cases per day, the math is pretty straightforward. 3% or so of new cases, 3% or so of COVID cases end up needing an ICU. And in today's world, an ICU in COVID, in the COVID world, an ICU means you need a ventilator. So those kind of numbers start to get pretty extreme in terms of what the health system can take. So then the question is, what type of economy would you have if you had scenes in many major cities of, what's happening in Lombardy right now? Meaning, nobody necessarily forced Milan to close or Lombardy to close, right? It was a local decision, and then it became national, because everyone was so terrified of not following in the footsteps of their northern neighbors in Italy. They kind of closed in response to that. So it almost is a decision made, throughout the country in the U.S., because none of us wanted to be like that. And I had no idea, for instance, in the first week of March, second week of March, what the prevalence in the community was. Now it turned out that everywhere else in the U.S. was not New York City, and so New York City went down a very, very particular path that the rest of the country did not go down. But it's hard to kind of fault folks for kind of making the decision. Again, I think a lot of people made the decision locally, whether it be the state level or city level, et cetera, that we weren't going to, we were going to try to shut down, mitigate, stop the flow of people, because we stop the flow of people, you stop the flow of the virus, and then see. The question now, of course, but of course now you have, this is a great point, like regionally, clearly now we know that this is much different across the country. There's a massive amount of economic pain going on right now. And how do you, can you do this opening or whatnot? Can you do that in a regional fashion? What would you give do you think it was unreasonable to kind of close, to kind of try, was it an unreasonable impulse to close down, basically all over, because we just didn't know where the virus was and what the prevalence of the virus was?
Well, I think if an area in the United States, I don't think New York ever became Milan, but if it and maybe it didn't become Milan because people shut down for the most part in New York. And I think a lot of people would just do that voluntarily and willingly without any government directive at
Right.
all. But the idea that it came from de Blasio or it came from Cuomo or whatever, I don't really have a problem with that. I just think that now we know. Okay, now we know. So let's open up and let's not cause any more pain.
How do you deal with the travel issues? Because one of the issues here is that regionally, because things are so different, it seems reasonable to me that places that are not hotspots, places that have very few cases or maybe no cases even, that they would be they could possibly open. The issue becomes, of course, if you open and you have a bunch of transmission, and then you have somebody from a high prevalence area come in and be at a local gathering, be at a local church, etc. Now suddenly you may create a problem in those areas. How should one deal with that?
Well, I guess for starters, this assumes that everyone distancing is the best way to deal with this over the long term. I mean, I'm not sure that we know that. That this disease,
we
this
certainly
virus
don't. Yeah, right.
I mean, this virus is always there. It's always on the other side of any shutdown or closure or travel ban. It's always there. It's not going away. It's not like a flea and tick season or something. It's always there. So I don't know the answer to what's the best way. Should we all be like Japan? Should we be like Sweden? Should we be like Taiwan or South Korea? I don't know, but I'm not convinced that self-quarantine has or will produce the best results in this case. I'm certainly not qualified to tell other people that they can't travel.
Right, but clearly the virus got here. I mean, clearly the virus got here somehow, right? I mean, and then the virus. I mean, how did and why did the virus not get here? Why did the virus not get here the same time it got to Italy, for instance? I mean, when you piece together, all of us have to require to try to piece together the story somehow. It seems there's some things that we know, there are a bunch of things that we don't understand, and the list of things that we don't understand in terms of how the virus is acting is very large, and there's no question about that. But there are some things that we do know. The virus hit China late December, mid-January, late January. Then we shut down travel January 31st from China, and we markedly limited the flights from the Far East to us. Of course, we didn't limit flights from Europe, and that seems to be the reasons why this rolling spread has happened, and why it didn't happen all over all at once. So, I mean, the virus. Yes, I don't know exactly what masks do. I don't know exactly what social distancing does, but clearly the virus can't travel without a host. And so just like, okay, fine, we restrict travel from China to the US, we decided that was a good idea. We decided the mistake that was made was not also restricting travel from places that didn't restrict travel from China. That was the idiotic thing. And if we had done that mid-February, maybe we wouldn't have the problem we did. So we know that travel is a significant component of this, right? Why domestically then do we decide, well, travel doesn't matter? I mean, at one point in New York and Brooklyn, there were 50% of tests were positive for COVID, right? That means 1 out of 2. So somebody from Brooklyn traveling to say go to a conference, say in Pittsburgh, say they went to a large church gathering in Pittsburgh, there's a good chance that you spread it among that local community. So that there are some things that we know. The local community now, right? Does it make sense for the local community to say, all right, we don't want outsiders from hotspots?
But why don't we do that for flu?
But because the flu doesn't seem to be as lethal as this particular virus, and there's some innate immunity that's built into the flu. So the flu, for instance, because of vaccination, because of antibodies that cross-react from one season to the next, there's a certain percentage of the population that has some innate immunity to the flu. Now, we were always worried that there would be a new flu strain that would create that the entire population, the global population, would be naive to, meaning there'd be no immunity to it. And so, which is what they think happened in 1917, 1918. So there's always that concern that there would be a new flu strain with much higher lethality than the normal flu. But it turns out the coronavirus, is one of those novel viruses that is much more easily transmissible than SARS or Ebola, and is unfortunately more lethal than the flu. And so when it gets when you get 8,000 new cases a day in a place like New York City, which is super dense, 3%, that's 240 ICU admissions per day that you have to deal with. So
I don't buy that argument.
What's that?
I don't buy that argument. No.
Why not?
Because going back to the original principles, why, how did that creep in? That is the role of governments to prevent, epidemics or natural. I mean, the vaccine was not around, 30 years ago, right? The flu vaccine.
Yeah.
And so was it the government, right?
But
there was at some point in history, right? Governments knew nothing about causes of pandemics and whatnot and so forth. Yeah. And but although they knew it would, it could communicate itself. Yeah. So at some point it became sort of acceptable that it was the government's role to tell people what to do and what not to do to respond to pandemics. And I think I want to explore that a little bit, because is it the radical idea here is that it's not the government's role to begin with to save lives, to save individual lives, because it doesn't do it for the flu. It doesn't do it, right? It's not, or what is the justification?
But Michelle, how do you have a look in 1918 there were 650,000 Americans that died. The population of America at the time was about 100 million. Right. So, I mean, and I think back in the day, like, the human life meant less. And we're now, meaning, the world wars had happened. The world wars were, had happened. World War II happened.
Right.
There was I think we were much more, it feels like there had a much more fatalistic sense of things. Now you don't have, it's very hard to have a functioning economy if that many people out of the population die. Meaning,
right, but
locally,
on the other hand, correct,
saying,
but
locally people would shut down. Like they wouldn't want to go to restaurants.
Yeah, no, because absolutely. But I mean, right now we're putting all our eggs in one basket, because we say it's the role of the government to prevent death on a large scale. Therefore, the government's going to have the monopoly on surveillance, on what actions to take, on this and that. Yeah.
No, I was just asking locally. Fine, locally. Like I'm saying, locally, does Pittsburgh? This is what we know. We know that people, if you introduce a virus which grows exponentially, and introduce it into a population with a certain density, that there's a chance that it'll rapidly climb and infect a significant portion of your population, right? So the question is, can Pittsburgh decide not to allow people from Philadelphia which is a current hotspot? Can Pittsburgh decide to keep those people out? Is that okay?
Jeff, I'm letting you.
I think it's okay. Look, there's a trade-off here. What kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world where you can travel easily and see the world, and bear the risk of potentially picking up a virus in your travels, or do you want to live in a world that's shut down and cloistered? I mean, I can't tell people in Pittsburgh. I'm not a Pittsburgher. I can't tell them, hey, you guys are being, xenophobic towards the city of brotherly love over there. From what I'm told, it really is two different states. And a lot of states have that. You've got upstate New York versus the city. You've got LA, San Francisco, this dichotomy. I mean, it's not my place to tell them no. And look, I'm a doctrinaire, libertarian, whatever, nothing more tedious than that. Right. But if you say, look, we're going to do this until, Pittsburgh's not going to allow any Philadelphians in until this COVID thing really cools down. Okay. I just wonder if that day ever comes. Things tend to ratchet up. They don't tend to ratchet down. So If you want, you know, and you could pose this to America more broadly. If you told Americans, look, there is this virus emanating out of a region in China, and it appears that we don't have much in the way of natural antibodies to it. It appears to be more virulent than regular flu. It's pretty scary. Let's cut off all flights from China for the next couple months. I think the vast majority of Americans would say, great, A-okay. But if you dig a little deeper and you start saying, we're not going to have any $5 t-shirts at Walmart because 70% of them are made in China or something, you know, and you start going down the rabbit hole, things get a little different. There's an awful lot of things people like about a global world, and that they imagine they could just give up so easily. And that's, you know, and look, it's easier in America because we're a big country. We could feed ourselves. We have energy, natural resources, et cetera. But if you're Japan or someplace like that, you have to live in a global world. You don't have the resources to be autarkic.
Isn't it interesting though that $5 T-shirt or the, you know, the cheap 80-inch TV that hangs in many an American's living room, that we didn't understand that there's now a cost to that wasn't appreciated before. Meaning the cost is in living in this interconnected world. And do you think Americans is one way to become pandemic proof for Americans to choose to have manufacturing more local, to pay a little bit extra so that they have a less chance of getting some virus from a bat or a civet or whatever?
Well, you know, do Americans need more stuff? I mean, you know, that's kind of an elitist thing to say, though. You know, I think the answer is probably yes. I think that they probably would. I think we're going to have. I think this is going to damage China in the international world. I think it's going to do a lot of damage to its manufacturing interests and to its, its ability to avail itself of markets like the U.S. I think even a Democratic president, if that's who replaces Trump, is going to, at least for the next, let's say 5 years or so after this, is going to have to be tough on China. That'll probably be the doctrine. And so I don't think this was in China's interest in any way. I don't think it was some sort of purposeful bio warfare. I think it hurts them actually very deeply. So I think that, Americans are probably going to get a little more insular and xenophobic as a result of this.
But what about the role of, we haven't talked about liability and using, we live in a world, again, where we rely on the public health directives and whatnot to tell us what to do and what not to do. What if, an airline is careless about who it, and they're all careless because they don't have to do it. But if they were held liable for allowing people with fevers, for example, people who are obviously where they be, a relatively simple means to screen passengers and how they move from place to place, especially when you know that there's an impending epidemic and whatnot. Why wouldn't that be a better way to sort of deal with, restricting, appropriately the movements of things without having government having to, take on that responsibility?
Well, I'd certainly prefer tort to the regulatory state if that's my choice. I saw an interesting 60 Minutes piece about Taiwan and how they had a sort of a scanner type thermometer that they were putting on people's foreheads as they entered a restaurant, for example, as just an initial screening. I guess if someone's over a certain thing, you just deny them access. America's pretty litigious. And I think, for instance, when you say, why aren't airlines more careful? I think the reason is that if some guy's hacking and coughing, pre-COVID, and he gets on the plane and they say, gee, I don't know, sir, we don't think you should be flying. He's going to sue them for that as well. So it's kind of a tough situation in America right now. I don't think that we're going to ramp up in anything like that anytime soon.
Right.
I would love premises liability or even employer liability. If you want to say, we're going to, the governor of South Dakota wants to say, hey, we're open for business, then, you can't force employees to come back, but if they do, does their employer bear any responsibility? And how do you even prove it in terms of causation in a lawsuit? How do you prove where you got the virus? Very difficult.
So hard.
Well, I mean, it is difficult, but I mean, but it's not impossible. I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, you can have, you don't have complete, evidence, but you can have some supporting, if somebody like there was this, the super spreader in Korea, in South Korea, this woman who, against the doctor's advice, went around infecting, I mean, and why shouldn't she be held liable? Why shouldn't she be thrown in jail? And if you have sort of legal precedents, which to me makes sense, that's a much more just and effective way of people will just be a lot more responsible and learn to be more responsible than if we just tell them, listen, just or invent some kind of scheme of social distancing or whatnot that we have no idea if it's effective or not. And
She was aware of having the virus.
Yeah, she had fever. She went to the hospital. The doctor said, stay at home and whatnot. And she went to church of one of these mega churches. And that was one of the reasons why it was well documented actually in the medical literature. And it's again we have technology. Actually we have scientific knowledge. We have knowledge about the germ theory of disease that did not exist 100 years ago, but now we understand these things better, and we can hold people more liable. We can hold companies, private businesses more liable, and therefore induce them to become more reliable and more better citizens, more accountable, more responsible. So I think that's how I would go instead of having, because really fundamentally the idea that that is the role of the government to spend lives when it reaches a certain threshold. Like, okay, the flu right now, it doesn't matter, but anything more than the flu, that doesn't make sense. What number of lives count as lives that the government should get involved in preventing? And it doesn't do a very good job of that. So I think really it's not the job. The job of the government is to maintain the cohesion of the community, right? The common good, if you will. Maintain the cohesion of the community. If 50,000 Americans die, or 100,000, or even 1 million, that really per se doesn't threaten the cohesion of the country. The country will survive all of that. So it's just individual people, and they need to figure out a way through the court system, through rules and behavior, and being better citizens, to avoid these catastrophes. So you're
saying the government does not have, both of you are saying the government does not have a responsibility to ensure that a certain place is free of lethal novel viruses.
Yeah, not only does it not have it, but it doesn't even it doesn't know the first thing about doing it. It doesn't do a very good job of it.
Well, I don't think Dr. Koch is buying this 1 million deaths number that you're throwing out here willy-nilly.
Well, no, I'm serious. Well, okay, I mean, I'm sure I'm sure I'm in the minority, maybe even among the three of us here, but it's I think it's fundamentally true. I think it's fundamentally true that it's not we get confused when we say that it's the job of the government to save lives because, look, the government has a police system, but the police is not. The police is here to maintain lawfulness in a way, not per se directly to keep somebody alive, right? I mean, to keep somebody alive for how long? I mean, people die all the time, right? It's a fact of life. We die. People have cancer. People die of this. People die. So it's not the job to prevent, to save more lives. And so that whole utilitarian calculus from the get-go is flawed. I'm met with total silence and disbelief.
No. I think it's the whole. I think a lot of Americans are gonna say that. Look, I need to have the ability to go to a restaurant and enjoy food.
Yeah, I know. Correct.
And not contract some.
I mean, listen. If we've accepted the government to be responsible for our retirement, to give us Social Security, then of course we're going to say that the government should, make sure we everything is safe and whatnot. So it's also, sort of a long-standing problem.
I know, but the converse is like we ask for government to give us that. It's the same thing as we need to. The government needs to ensure that there aren't like roving gangs of whatever band of Crips and Bloods that are
Yeah.
going down your main street and shooting up places of establishment, because obviously if that's happening and there's a 10% chance that you may die when you go out to get a drink with your friends or go out to have some coffee with your friends, then you're not going to go there. I mean, regardless of what people say or what the government says. So in that same vein, I think a lot of
interesting,
people
but that's actually a very good point, but it's not true. So the government is not there. So it's not preventing, I mean, it's not there with lockdown. I mean, you could have a lockdown because there are gangs, right? But it doesn't do that. Now, if you're a gang and
it tries to eliminate the gangs.
But it's still it's relatively limited in what it does about gangs.
No,
right?
What do you
mean? Because it doesn't. You have to have criminal activity to begin with for them to be able to go and crack down, right? But potentially anybody can be a gang member and anybody can go around and smash cars and whatnot. Right.
Yes. So if that starts to happen, very quickly there'll be a response, and they are removed from.
Right. So they're removing the actual. Right. So they're coming. I think there's a distinction that it's not the same as what they're doing when they're applying public health measures that sort of shut down the whole thing. Because here they're shutting down lawful behavior. I mean, they're shutting down people going about their business, not doing anything.
That's because they don't have if they could go around and spray whatever the Chinese theater they were doing. What were they spraying? Just fake smoke or something? I don't know what they were doing. But
Lysol.
Lysol. I mean, if the government could do that and actually eliminate a virus, they would. You know what I mean? But
they wouldn't have to, because people would do it on their own, right? If there was such a Lysol, people would do it on their own.
Right. Well, that's partly what's going on is that you're trying to, the government or locally or nationally, whatever, statewide, they're trying to create they have to like kind of calm the populace right now. And the populace right now is terrified of this particular virus.
But if we didn't have 24-hour cable news, if we didn't have social media, if we didn't have the internet, so call it 1990, let's say, this would be a minor story in most of America. It would.
I don't think so.
At first, it would have showed up in international newspapers about some outbreak in Wuhan, China, and then it slowly some news would have trickled in about Milan, and it would have been Walter Cronkite might have mentioned it, and the average American wouldn't think about it at all. And then what was happening in New York would have happened. So a strange outbreak that may be related to China. And most people across the country would never have given a second moment's thought to that New York City story, and everyone would just be out doing what they do right now. And the only difference there'd be no difference in the virus or its virality, or let's just say air travel was as robust, but there was just no internet, no 24-hour cable news, and no social media. I don't think we've been noticing this. I think Jeff,
it's at least in modern times, meaning maybe again not in Michelle's times, modern times, meaning the time I've been alive. We haven't seen these type of scenes where you have hospitals that normal hospitals have 2 intensive care units, right, or maybe 3 intensive care units, right? These hospitals now have 5, 6, 7 intensive care units. Again, the capacity of the American health system is amazing, and they've expanded a massive amount the number of people that they're seeing that are on ventilators at any one given time. The number of people that are dying normally was 200 people a day dying. Now they're 800 people a day dying. There are healthcare workers that are getting sick, contracting the virus, getting on ventilators, and then dying. This is not. I mean, yes, that happens with the flu, but I mean, I don't know. You tell me, Michelle, in your 80 years of
how it was back in 1917, right?
I mean, how that's not something that's in our vocabulary. Meaning, we don't feel this when I have a person that has a flu that's in the hospital, and I go into that person's room. There's not this fear that I have that there's a non-zero chance or non-whatever percent chance that I may contract this, end up on a ventilator, and end up dying from this. I mean, I don't with good reason, not just because of watching cable news, but because of the number of healthcare workers that have been infected, ended up on a ventilator, ended up dying. This is clearly there's something different about this. It's not just a bump up of X number of cases a day. I think you're absolutely right in that we're a much softer country because Like, we're not used to people dying in any numbers now. So, and of course, every single person that dies, certainly anyone who's less than 40 that dies, it goes viral, and it looks like 40,000 people under the age of 40 is dying. So there's clearly that Kim Kardashian type of, phenomenon that's going on, in terms of amplifying rare events to make them much more so. But there's clearly something different about what's going on now that we in the medical community have never, at least in my lifetime, we haven't quite experienced, and that's why it seems so different. So I think this would have made waves at any point in the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And I think there's a massive desire from people, especially in the medical community, not to go through this type of thing. And some of that is narrow self-interest, because we know that you can contract this, that this is very infectious, that if you suck in too much of a viral load, you can, even if you're young, healthy, end up on a ventilator and end up dying. So I think those are some of the things. And you're right, it is a little bit selfish, if you will, because obviously we're basically shutting down the entire American economy because of somewhat of the self-interest of the health system, the healthcare workers, who are, a lot of them are scared.
But again,
is this worse than H1N1?
Yeah, absolutely.
And SARS and avian flu and Ebola.
SARS, SARS and Ebola are similar. SARS and Ebola are similar, but again, SARS and Ebola don't seem to have this level of. They were much more containable than this particular virus is. So it's just, the problem is that it's so much more infectious than this. I mean, Ebola has never made it, other than some travelers and somebody who was shipped over, 3-4 cases in the US. To deal, I don't think we've ever had a case where you have 8,000, in the densest city, 8,000 new cases, 30% of which get admitted to the ICU. And those people are getting the ICU they're on the ventilator for 2 to 3 weeks. That kind of strain. Ebola, you get it, you're dead in a short period of time. You're not able to transmit it until you're very sick. SARS is somewhat similar in terms of not having a lot of asymptomatic spread. This, unfortunately, is just much more infectious for reasons that will be elucidated at some point.
But then, if I concede a role for the government here, then maybe the government should be just precisely to provide, whenever the epidemic or the number of deaths starts to threaten the integrity of the community, whatever the community might be, if you're going to talk locally or at the state level or whatnot, that if it starts to threaten just because of its magnitude, then the government, maybe the role should be for the government to provide the extra capacity, right? Capacity, the extra, right. To fly and whatnot. And they fail on that as well. I mean, I know in California, apparently there were X thousands or how many ventilators, a program of having extra ventilators that was scrapped just a few years ago by the governor, and other governors have done, similar things, and, who knows. But maybe that would be go ahead.
But if we get back to Michel's point about liability and insurance, I mean, I can understand from a market perspective, doctors, hospitals, nurses, insurance companies, everybody has to get paid. Everybody has to make a living. There's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't view that as evil. And so in the ordinary course of things, when there's not any sort of epidemic or pandemic, our hospitals, for example, are just going to sit around with 30% excess capacity in order to be prepared for a once in 20 or 30 year virus? Well, the answer is probably no. So if we have a system, and I know a lot of doctors are probably rightfully dubious about insurance companies at this point, but if we have a system of insurance and then reinsurance so that the insurance company themselves can spread the risk, and then you say, look, as an insurance company, we're on the hook. We're the liability provider for this hospital group or this physician's group. And so if a pandemic does happen, it's ultimately on us. Then the insurance company presumably becomes a self-interested partner with the hospital or with the physicians group and says, hey, look, we're gonna have some warehouses around the country. We're just gonna have a bunch of ventilators in them, and it sounds uneconomic to have them sitting there rotting, but our potential liability is so great. in the event of that once in decades pandemic, that we're going to do it anyway. I mean, there has to be a way to bring skin in the game.
Yeah, no, I was going to bring that up. I think your point in the piece, what governors can do, you have a bunch of points that are laid out that are really interesting. But that was I thought it really brilliant. Meaning, the problem is the federal government is almost useless in terms of trying to figure out who has what needs, right? And there's a lot of politics, and it's like as to like who gets what ventilator, who's getting the peak and stuff. But it makes sense to do this at a much more granular level, like you're saying. So if individual folks had insurance, the insurance companies had to pay out for deaths, correct? Then the insurance companies have all sorts of interest in preventing the virus from getting here. If the virus does get here, having enough personal protective equipment, which is a huge issue because it's almost impossible to go from 1x to 10x within a course of a month and have enough widgets to do this variety of stuff. So that would be a super interesting way of doing it. I mean, Wimbledon, right, apparently has pandemic insurance, and they paid $2 million a year for the last 17 years or something, and now they're going to get a massive payout. But I was going to ask you, Jeff. I mean, the insurance company didn't really do anything to prevent a pandemic. Meaning, is it in some level, is the local insurance company kind of too weak, unable to kind of prevent these kind of global? Because then the insurance company that's insuring Wimbledon would somehow need to be able to control the levers of, all right, you can't get visitors in from, we got to cut off travel. How the heck does the insurance company doing that locally? They don't have that power, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess they put a rider on the policy. I've read that the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, which was canceled, I guess that was in April or May, they had declined a rider to their insurance policy for pandemics. So unlike Wimbledon, they're not covered for all the losses involved. Maybe an insurance company would just make the cold calculation and say, paying $1 million to 30,000 families, with once in every 30 years is just worth it. In the long run, but I don't know. I think that's sort of a question for an insurance company. But it sounds nice. It sounds like the whole point of insurance is to get everybody's incentives aligned. Right. And right now, it feels like people's incentives aren't aligned. In fact, oftentimes, government agencies do better when there's more deaths, more failures, when things aren't cut off at the pass. So, at least with insurance, you've ultimately got somebody on the hook who's paying, and it might take lawsuits. They might kick and scream. It might be very difficult, but at the end of the day, they are potentially liable, and so nobody has more incentive than them, other than obviously the sick person, their family themselves.
Yeah, I'm going to take the cynical point and say that the most likely thing they'll do, because they would seem to be too much of it's too much for them to handle. They're more likely to just argue that this wasn't a COVID death and we're not going to pay out because it's not a COVID death.
Well, from what I'm reading, your typical life insurance policy, term life policy, does cover your death from a pandemic. Yeah. They don't usually exclude that, as long as it's not some sort of accidental injury policy. So it sounds like they're going to pay. I haven't heard anybody saying that they've made a claim because Dad died.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, we have the life insurance policies. I mean, we would think they would have a significant interest, correct, in trying to prevent pandemics.
But the numbers aren't that big. I mean, 22,000 deaths in the U.S. spread across however many. What percentage of them had life insurance? Maybe half. Yeah. And then there's 10 companies.
Yeah, that's not an issue.
Jeff, in your letter to the governors, you talk about governors reopening the courts and facilitating mediation for renegotiation of contracts, rents, and because sort of in this deflationary environment. Tell us about that. I thought that was a very interesting idea with your legal background.
Well, it's very, very scary to start issuing directives that say people don't have to pay their rent or pay their
Yeah,
mortgages.
exactly.
It's a very difficult way to run a society, because an awful lot of people are going to look at that and say, well, I don't know if I should, sign this lease, or I don't know if I should own this property. So that's a very, very slippery slope. And I think it's a bad precedence. But that being said, it's not really in anyone's interest to have a bunch of evictions and foreclosures right now. You can't even get to court if you wanted to. But so I think if governors were going to do something useful, they could be thinking a couple months down the line, when hopefully things are a little more back to normal in terms of opening, and get landlords and tenants and mortgage companies and mortgage holders together. Mortgagees and mortgage holders together, and start sitting down at the table now and try to figure out how you might renegotiate those things, because it's just such a huge unknown out there. I live in a college town of about 75,000 people, and we don't even know what local restaurants are going to look like a month from now. If this lockdown is open, we have no idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's instead they're printing money to try to right, to keep spending, as I mean, sounds like the last thing you want to do is to make it's almost sort of symbolic money.
Jeff, can you speak to that? I mean, what do you see as some of the downsides of this massive amount of debt that's being accrued? I hear, I have no, yeah. What are the downsides, and what is the time frame that we would see those downsides in?
Well, the downside is that you're creating new money and credit in society without any new goods or services. You're creating the sense that there's a free lunch, that you can have something for nothing, that we can all sit at home for a couple months and produce nothing and get money from the government and use that money to go out and get real goods and services. And I don't think that's true. There's a price to be paid for it. Now, how far down the road it is in terms of inflation, we don't know. But, a lot of this is funded by U.S. Treasury debt, because there's the fiscal policy where they're sending people checks from the Treasury and holding off on tax payments and that sort of thing. But there's also the monetary policy side, where the Federal Reserve is creating huge amounts of money to either loan or purchase, either loan to banks and mutual funds, and now bond funds, and potentially ETFs, and pretty soon I would suspect the stock market. But they're also buying Treasury debt and mortgage-backed securities and that sort of things from commercial banks. So that's great as long as it works. I mean, the Fed's balance sheet is now up at $6 trillion. It was less than $1 trillion just in 2008 when this whole crisis, when the 08 crisis happened. So what that means is that there's always going to be a market, at least in the short term, for Treasury debt, that Congress can just spend and spend and spend and paper over the difference in what it raises in taxes by issuing debt. And there's always going to be a buyer for that debt called the Federal Reserve. And how does the Federal Reserve buy it? It just creates money out of thin air and gives it to the banks in exchange for it. So that's a neat trick, especially when interest on those Treasury notes is 1% or less. I mean, right now a 10-year T-bill is less than 1%. You got to ask yourself, is the rest of the world going to loan us money for 10 years at less than 1%? Is there anything about the U.S. government that makes you think its fiscal house is going to be in order anytime soon? I mean, with all the entitlements obligations we have, all the debt, all the single year deficits will probably be, several $1 trillion just this year in 2020. That strikes me as the kind of spendthrift from whom you should demand junk bond rates, not 1%. If you're going to loan Uncle Sam money, you ought to be getting 25% for your risk, and you're not getting that. So, if I knew how all that would work and how it would unfold, I'd go out and short stocks and do what I had to do to protect myself. But the timing of it is way above my pay grade.
Jeff, Trump issued a tweet, an executive tweet today.
A tweet.
Yes, telling that governors actually don't have any rights, right? I don't know if you saw it. he was saying that it's the role of the federal government to shut down and not shut down and whatnot, and governors don't have any authority. What's your legal perspective or your experience, your political experience with that, and what does he mean? I mean, it's not all that clear what he meant.
Well, it's nothing new. I mean, this is, I would say the 10th Amendment has been dead since at least the 1860s. So, I don't really know what the point of looking to the Constitution is. I mean, that he is right in a perverse sense, in that states at this point are just glorified counties of the federal government, because the federal government has the carrot and the stick. And what states can't do is print money. And because they can't print money, that means they're up against natural limits, especially with respect to the huge amount of unemployment claims they're about to get and the huge drop in tax receipts they're about to experience. So, the federal government's going to run this show because it's going to be the bailer-outer. So, I mean, from a constitutional perspective, that's complete nonsense. Clearly, the states have full authority to do that. But I mean, that we might as well talk about the Magna Carta if we're going to talk about the 10th Amendment.
Right.
What about the fact that Bill de Blasio said we're going to keep the schools closed for the rest of the year, and then the next hour, I think Andrew Cuomo said, no, Bill de Blasio does not control whether the schools open or shut.
Well, I have a lot of very warm affection in my heart for both of those men, and so it's very hard for me to judge which one is right. But at the end of the day, I would suspect de Blasio's funding is as dependent on Albany as most governors' funding is dependent on Washington.
I see.
Jeff, is there the possibility of not in the short term and not in practical ways, but long term, in terms of I want you to put your sociological hat on, of how people are going to change their ways of living in response to this, what we're living through here. You talk a lot about localism. I mean, you had a piece just recently, it was very good, about titled "All Crises Are Local." And I don't think it's realistic to expect that all of a sudden the federal government is going to be more constitution-minded than it has been so far, and so forth. But at the same time, I mean, is there sufficient countercurrent from people locally that we can hope that there be some more humane ways of living together develop in the future?
I'm not sure I know. It's hard to say. When I said that all crises are local, let me just give you an example. Let's say you're Bill Gates and you're exceedingly wealthy. That doesn't really protect you in a situation like this, because you're still dependent. Let's say you build your own surgical suite in your house and you stock it with drugs and you have 3 doctors on your payroll. They still have to drive to your house, right? And so there still has to be electricity to your house. There still has to be running water to your house. So at the end of the day, whenever there's a crisis for each and every one of us, our electricity, our food, water, and potential medical care is all instant right where we are. And that's it. You can't escape that. So, will people bolster things at home? Will it get us away from some of the short-term thinking? In my mind, the root cause of short-term thinking is artificially low interest rates. And we're not raising interest rates, we're lowering them even more, which just causes more speculation. You ask, well, why do all these private equity firms own hospitals? Well, that's a big part of the reason, is the financialization of everything. So I hope we rethink that. But I can't speak to people's personal choices or morality. I mean, that's again well above my pay grade.
Jeff, it's where can people follow you? And I couldn't encourage people more than to follow you both on Twitter and on the Mises.org website.
Well, just on Twitter at Jeff Deist, JEFFDEIST is the best place to keep up with me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks so much.
Okay.